Well, good morning. I'm Anne-Marie Green, and welcome to our special coverage of the 80th anniversary of D-Day. President Biden, world leaders, and veterans are gathering in Normandy to commemorate the Allies' invasion of Nazi-occupied France in 1944. The offensive destroyed much of Hitler's military presence in Western Europe and became a massive turning point in World War II, which would end a year later. So we have team coverage for you of today's historic anniversary ceremony with senior foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata, CBS's Elaine Cobb, and history professor Alan Alport, all standing by. Charlie, I want to start with you, though. You've been in Normandy for a few days now. Set the scene for us this morning.
Yeah, Anne-Marie, today is a day for remembrance. It's a solemn day. You know, when you look behind us, it's a glorious day here, just beyond Omaha Beach in Normandy, where the ceremony will be taking place shortly, has started taking place, you know, and here at the American Cemetery, where so many American dead lie from D-Day itself. And I think that's what it's about. When we talk about the world in Europe, we talk about this being the beginning of what happened. And that day itself and the level of sacrifice and the thousands of troops, many American troops that came in here, flooding in here. And we've spoken to a few of the remaining veterans. You know, the sun is setting on the D-Day generation who will give us living testimony. And when you talk to these men who are 99, 100 years old, they remember very clearly. They said, yes, it was about democracy, protecting democracy and freedom and the defeat of Nazis, but really it was about trying to save their own lives and saving the lives of their buddies as they stormed this beach.
Yeah, and you know, I've listened to interviews with some of the veterans and actually spoke to a veteran just the other day. And one of the things that he said is that he believed that this was going to be the end of all wars, that we wouldn't have to see another war. Certainly that was not right, but that's part of what fueled them at many of them at the tender age of 19, 20, very young men.
Yes, and when you suggest that, yes, and there has been a level of success in terms of avoiding a third world war, and that's some of the messages that we'll hear here, because it's a time to not only anniversaries about remembrance, but also about taking stock, and this will be a reinforcement of that alliance. But you will hear today, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is here. Russian President Vladimir Putin is not here. There is an existing threat in Europe, a threat to the alliance, a threat to U.S. interests and their European partners here. So it certainly wasn't a war to end all wars. The conflicts continue, and these are the challenges that are facing America and its allies on this very soil.
Right, certainly something we'll be discussing today. Elaine, I want to ask you what it's been like in Normandy over the past few days. As I understand it, has been quite a gathering there, including very many people sort of almost dressed in the uniforms of the era. Not quite a reenactment, but people almost a little bit trying to relive that part of history.
Anne-Marie, there are more than 1 million visitors here along the beaches this year. That is the most number they've ever had. There are people from all over Europe. I've seen Czechs, Belgians, French, British and Americans, of course. And yes, there are many people who have the costumes, who own jeeps that they bring along here, and there are varying levels of what they're doing. Some say this is their way of paying tribute, and certainly when we saw this some years ago, when there was a lot fewer, it felt a little more like a respectful tribute. This year I've been talking to the locals who say there is just such a huge number of people riding around in jeeps wearing the uniforms of the age that they feel maybe it's really not the right thing to be doing. There are still people alive in Normandy who were children during the war, who lived through it, who saw real jeeps and real soldiers and may find it triggering. And they feel that there's a level of respect that may have slipped this year because there are just so many of these camps dotted around Normandy of people who are getting into almost the film kind of spirit of it. And one local said to me, this isn't a movie set. This isn't Disneyland.
It's a bit surreal.
It is, definitely.
Because you can't, when you say 1 million people, this is a small area. You cannot move during the day. And you will just see, we are not exaggerating when you say dozens of Jeeps in a row. Going
in a row, yeah.
Everybody camping out. It's almost, and this is what I think what Elaine is alluding to, it's almost like a festive atmosphere. And people are really getting into it. And I think, yes, there's a vulgarity that I think we can probably address there, but it's also, these are the individuals who keep this alive as, the actual veterans of D-Day and World War II pass away.
Right.
Yeah, there's a bit of both there, and it kind of depends on where it is and how much it is. And I think that's why some of the locals are saying, it used to be nice, we're not quite so sure now.
I get that.
And, the level of Jeeps in a convoy when none of them are actually military sort of seems odd.
I know, it's us. I get that.
Right. No, it makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider the contrast of the actual day 80 years ago. Not just, sort of Mother Nature, where it was overcast and windswept, but obviously the tremendous sacrifices that were made. A lot went right, but also a lot went wrong on that day. And so I want to sort of delve a little bit into the history. Let's go back in time, right? Let's talk a little bit about why the Allies, why the U.S. and Canada and Britain and several other nations, but these were sort of the three main contributors, why they felt it was important at that moment to launch this invasion, why they felt this was the time to try to tip the war.
Yeah, here we go. All right, you ready?
Yeah, well, it was a coordinated effort. First of all, it had a lot to do with intelligence and throwing the Germans off. This is a heavily defended area, but the Germans weren't expecting the attack here when it happened. And they certainly weren't expecting to be overwhelmed with the sheer number of forces that flooded in here. Over 120,000, imagine 7,000 naval vessels here, tens of thousands of aircraft, 18,000 paratroopers behind enemy lines dropping out of those C-47s. They knew that they would have to hit the German army hard, and it was not only just the element of surprise, but the sheer number. And yet, even with that sort of overwhelming force, D-Day itself was 3 days long before they were able to get anywhere near securing this area. And then, of course, World War II, in order to defeat the Nazis, went on for another 11 months. When I was talking to some of the veterans that were here on D-Day, they said the skies were black and they were getting fired at everywhere. They were getting mortared, and they just didn't think they were going to make it out alive. And many didn't. And I asked them how you dealt with that fear. You just took a deep breath and just kept marching forward in the belief that, get the other guys before they got you.
Yeah. And a lot of the impetus as well, of course, let's not forget, was from Britain, because it wasn't very long since the Dunkirk, where the British forces were forced back. And so Churchill was saying, we need to do something, Britain is next, and we'd rather not have to fight on the British shores. France was like, once they're over there, we're lost, you will forget us. So there was a big push between the two of them to say, let us do this now. And as you mentioned, the weather was a big factor. In fact, it was an Irish lighthouse keeper who finally gave the go-ahead, because she was watching the weather and the US Embassy had said, we need you to let us know. And so she said, it's cloudy, it's bad weather. And then she said, okay, it's lifting. On June 4th, she said, we think it's lifting. We think you've got some chance. And they went, let's just do it. And so they went ahead. My father was actually in the Royal Air Force flying bombing sorties over Germany. And he flew back that morning. And they knew it was coming. And he said he was flying back in. And below them, they could see all of the boats as dawn rose. And he's like, it's now. And he said it was just amazing when they got back to their base. There were so few people left because everyone else was out, but they were all so high they couldn't go to bed after their sortie because they knew this is it.
Right. And I mean, it's remarkable the success that it was, because there were so many things that could go wrong and did go wrong. And, you spoke, Charlie, we saw your excellent story following in the footsteps of these paratroopers who landed ahead of the ground troops. And they are and you point out, and watching your story alone, to me, I was nervous for you, but you point out that you're doing it in broad daylight without being shot at. They are doing this by the light of the moon, and part of the reason why this had to happen when it happened is because they wanted to provide the element of surprise, and they wanted to do it under cover of darkness, and they needed at least the light of the moon, and the full moon was not going to be there for very long.
No, and that is what complicated the operation for those paratroopers. So in my piece, you saw 3 of those C-47s, the British call them Dakotas. There were maybe 20 people on mine. Imagine 700 of them, more than 700. Trying to get over this area. The drop zone, I continue to try to say that in that piece, because what I was sharing, anything could have happened, right? Your parachute could fail, you could come out very, very badly and go into a twist. At the very least, you're going to miss the drop zone. You might hit a canal. That actual field that I dropped into, which was the center of the paratroopers' operation, that's the very same place, which isn't here, way behind enemy, well, way behind, a mile or 2 behind enemy lines in order to secure that beachhead. That was hard to hit even in the day. That whole area was flooded. There were people that had safe landings, as it were, and drowned because it was so marshy. Then they had to get up and they were fighting. And the way that you land in a nighttime landing is you put your kit behind or below you. So they've got kit that's weighing between 70 and 100 pounds. It's got all their gear, they got their ammunition, they got their weaponry. And in the dark, all you do as you're coming down, you can't see the ground. You just hear when it hits and then brace for impact. So that's what they were dealing with. And of course, they're getting shot on the way down. German anti-aircraft fire, which is firing into the skies. So their planes were going down, they were going off course, the weather was bad, planes were getting lost. Paratroopers were getting lost. They were scattered all over Normandy. I mean, we've seen one on the church, of course.
St. Mary Glees, he got stuck on the spire,
right?
Yes.
And I can just imagine, I mean, mine was about as easy as it could be. We're at 1,200 feet, but you could see it took a little bit of effort to be able to get down and to hit that drop zone. Imagine if you were being shot at, and imagine it's late at night, or it's dark, and it's wet and stormy, and you got to figure out where your unit commander is, and then you got to fight. You got to hit the ground running and fighting.
Right, and that's sort of the initial phase of the assault on D-Day, Elaine. And then the boats begin to cross the channel, and they're coming close to shore. But it is so windy, it is so wavy that the troops, as they're preparing to land and waiting, are getting seasick.
Yes, it was a rough crossing, and because they all had to be ready to jump out, they're all massed on the edge. There's no find somewhere comfortable to try and feel better. And of course, they're scared. Logically enough, they know they are being sent in great numbers because they can't all survive. And so they know they have to jump. And of course, the landing craft from the ships could only go so far. So they all had to jump into the water. They had to keep their weapons as dry as they could manage. Some of them, and the Germans opened fire. So some
had to get around mines.
And they had the mines, but some of them never even got out of the landing craft. They were killed there. Others were killed in the water. Others were killed as they hit the beaches. And then, there were those Czech hedgehogs, the crosses with barbed wire that the Germans had put up. So there was so much there for them to get through in order to make it. And some years ago, I met a veteran here who said, I was told, look for the spire at St. Église and head for that. You won't know anything else, but head for that. That's your point. And that was the point on his little stretch of the beaches.
Incredible. Charlie, I know that you have to pivot over to some other duties, so we're going to say goodbye to you for now. Hopefully we'll get to talk to you later on in the day. Elaine, you're staying with us, and I want to bring in Professor Alan Allport, who's also going to be joining us. Professor, I don't know if you were listening to our conversation as we wait for the ceremony to begin, but what I have been sort of always stunned by when I kind of dig into the details of this day and this operation is just how many hurdles the troops had to go through to make this a successful mission. And this changed the course of history. But many did not even make it off the beaches.
No, that's absolutely right. The D-Day was the culmination of many years of preparation, knowing how difficult it was going to be. The British and Canadians had already attempted something like this on a smaller scale back in 1942, in August 1942, at the port of Dieppe. And it had been a disaster because of unforeseen events that happened on the day. The troops couldn't get off the beaches, the tanks couldn't get off the beaches, and in the end, they had to evacuate rather hurriedly and took thousands of casualties. So that was very much in the minds of the planners 2 years later. But they were doing it on an even bigger scale. There were going to be 150,000 troops landed. And you could only do it once. If D-Day failed, there was no way of being able to attempt it again. So everything, or at least as much as possible, had to go right on the day, which meant taking into account all kinds of very unpredictable circumstances, how much the Germans would be prepared, what the defenses would be like. Such intangible factors which have already been mentioned about the weather. The weather in June 1944 was unexpectedly bad, and the English Channel, which if any of you have ever crossed the English Channel in a ferry, you know that even though it's a very small stretch of water, it can be rather unpredictable. And the invasion was originally supposed to take place on June 5th and had to be cancelled at the last minute because the storms were so bad. And right up until the final hours, nobody actually knew if they were going to be able to do it on the 6th. And if they couldn't do it on the 6th, there were all kinds of tidal patterns and the position of the moon and things like that needed to be taken into account, which meant you couldn't just keep on pushing it off by 24 hours. You'd have to push it off by weeks potentially, so the intangibles must have been an enormous burden on the minds of the people who were having to plan this.
Alan, thank you so much for sort of setting the scene for us, what it was like that day. Stand by. I just want to pivot over to Ed O'Keefe. Ed, you are in Paris. You've been following along with the president. The president will be speaking today along with the Secretary of Defense and I believe also the Secretary of State. Perhaps not, but the president of France will be speaking. Give us a sense of what we expect to hear from the president.
Anne-Marie, he's been in Normandy now for a few hours meeting with American veterans who stormed those beaches either today or in the days following. Just a handful of them there, the youngest in their early 90s, one of them telling him a little while ago he's 104 years old. They've been exchanging pleasantries and challenge coins, taking photos, and the president told one of them, quote, "You saved the world." He will speak shortly at this event there in Normandy, as many other commanders and chiefs have done before him. It is part of this ongoing 5-day trip here to France that includes a speech tomorrow at Pointe du Hoc, which is another location about 7 or 8 miles to the east of where he is this morning, to remarks not only on what happened there on those beaches, but about the future of democracy around the world, the White House tells us. Saturday and Sunday is for a state visit with the French President Emmanuel Macron and various military parades and a state dinner and the usual trappings of these kinds of official visits. One other encounter we're waiting for is a meeting he's supposed to hold with the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky. They're expected to see each other today at these events and then hold a more formal one-on-one tomorrow at some point. Zelensky is here as an invited guest of the French government. He will be at the G7 meetings in Italy again next week, pushing his European and American allies to give him more flexibility, more firepower in his ongoing war with Russia. We'll see whether the American president is willing to give him any more of that, despite saying that the American involvement, at least for now, is limited to what it is. But this is obviously an important symbolic moment for any American president, and we'll see the president shortly honor the service of those who survived and those who didn't, and reaffirm the United States' allyship with France, its oldest ally. Remember, and I think Charlie and Elaine especially have done such a good job of reminding us of the history, but one of the important factors to remember is that this day especially to the French people in that part of France and across the country is really why the United States and what the U.S. military did is held in such high regard by the French people, liberating them from the Nazis and ensuring their eventual freedoms again, and for a country that adopted American-style democracy, too. It was but another important date in the U.S.'s longest relationship with another country. Anne-Marie.
Very good reminder, Ed. I want to go back to something that is sort of significant for today, that Volodymyr Zelensky was an invited guest. Vladimir Putin was not. Russia was an ally during World War II. And we've spoken about this earlier in the week, but you cannot help but to reflect on the modern day echo, if you will, of history, right? That line, I actually found out that line is often attributed to Mark Twain, whether it's true or not, that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes, that you can't help but to see parallels with what we're dealing with today.
Yeah, the fact that nobody from the Russian Federation was invited is notable. There had been talk in Macron's government of inviting representatives, but ultimately, amid concerns expressed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and others, there will be nobody here from Russia, at least formally, attending these events, in part because Zelensky had been invited to demonstrate sort of the real world or the present day dangers that Europe faces as that conflict continues. So it is a notable snub, but it's an understandable one, especially here in France, a country that has committed itself so much to the Ukrainian war effort that President Macron has suggested that at some point, if necessary, he would commit French military troops into Ukraine, even outside the NATO obligations, which is something just about every other country involved, at least so far, has declined to do. So a slap and a snub of Putin, but an understandable one given the times. And you're right, a reminder of how this continent has faced these kinds of challenges before and is certainly facing one right now.
And you mentioned that in his remarks, he's going to be making a connection between World War II and what's happening on the world stage today. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also said that that's what we can expect from the president. I imagine, though, for the president, too, there are a couple of audiences here. Why do you think both domestic and foreign, I presume, but why do you think it is important for the president to highlight this connection?
Well, it's kind of a must-attend for whoever's commander-in-chief. I mean, since Eisenhower, presidents have been coming here in one way or another to mark this day and the sacrifice of those who served. That this is the last one that veterans are likely to be alive for when we hit the 5-year marks, if we put most attention on the 75th, the 80th. Conceivably, by the 85th, there may be but just a hand's worth of veterans still alive who were there either today or in the days after. We were told by American Airlines, for example, they used to fly something like 6 plane loads of veterans over to attend these ceremonies, and this year they were only able to fill part of one aircraft. So it shows you just how their numbers are dwindling and why it was important for the president to be able to be here with those that are here. And look, it rings home with audiences who, are either military families or people who take national security seriously when it comes to picking a president, to see him on the world stage, to be reaffirming and sustaining alliances that he takes quite seriously and believes many Americans do as well. It's a sharp contrast with former president, potentially future President Trump, who was known to have frostier, more difficult relations, especially with European leaders. And so it will inevitably end up in election imagery and rhetoric, and that's another reason why they're here, but certainly not the primary one, given that there's an understanding among whoever is president that this is an important day and it's important to be here.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much. Elaine, you are in Normandy. I know that things are probably sort of getting underway now in terms of this ceremony. Can you tell us what's happening there now?
It's slipping a little late, in fact, Anne-Marie, but you can probably hear behind me the helicopters are here. And so President Biden has already arrived at the cemetery. He has been meeting privately with some of the American veterans, both President Biden and Dr. Jill Biden talking to them. And then they will come over to meet with President Macron and his wife Brigitte before they both head together to the stage where the veterans are assembled and other guests. Now, one of the first things President Macron is going to do is to give the Legion of Honor to around a dozen U.S. veterans. This is the highest honor that France can give to anybody, and as foreigners, they receive it for their great contribution to France and to national security and to the life of France, as it's put.
Stand by for me, Elaine. I want to bring in Professor Allport. Professor, Ed and I were talking about the fact that Vladimir Putin was not invited to this remembrance, and Russia was an ally at the time of the Second World War. But how things have changed. I wonder how, when you sort of consider that, how you think about the way the relationships have evolved over the last 80 years.
Yes, well, it's a high irony, isn't it, that while D-Day was taking place, there was also bitter fighting going on in Ukraine at that very moment in the summer of 1944. And there's no denying that part of the explanation for the success of D-Day is that the Germans were very busy fighting another enemy thousands of miles away on the Eastern Front. One of the things which is so remarkable about the Allied coalition that won World War II was that there was a remarkable degree of cooperation between the United States, the United Kingdom, other allies in the West, and the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, who was undoubtedly a dictator, but one who was willing to work with the Western powers in a common purpose. The Soviet Union had been represented at previous commemorations of D-Day back in the Cold War, and then after the Cold War, Russia was also represented too. So it's entirely understandable why they're not there today, and why, particularly with President Zelensky being there, that there's a very different focus. But it is nonetheless one of the high ironies of history that, in a sense, the Russians are the kind of invisible contributor to success on D-Day, but present-day politics means that it's very difficult to be able to kind of really represent that.
Just letting people know how things are unfolding here. King Charles has spoken already, and we are awaiting remarks from President Emmanuel Macron, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and of course, President Biden. We'll be dipping in as soon as we hear from those men. And there's some video of King Charles and Queen Camilla. Professor, also what sort of happened, wasn't sure we're going to dip in or not. So in the wake of the Second World War, what you saw was a continuation of this cooperation between nations, which eventually gives birth to NATO. And I wonder if we are far from that, I guess, that sense of cooperation that we had, 80 years ago. As you've watched the relationships between countries evolve, I mean, it does almost seem like there is kind of a resurgence in terms of the value that countries have on when it comes to maintaining these sort of relationships.
Well, of course, the Americans had been to France before in the 20th century. They had been taken part in the defeat of Germany in World War I. But after that war, American troops had left Europe and had returned back to the United States. And that was, I think, later seen as being one of the contributory factors towards the rise of the dictators in Europe and the onset of World War II. So it was very important both to President Roosevelt and then to his successor, President Truman, in 1945, that the American commitment to the defense of Europe, which, if you like, began on the morning of June 6th, when American troops first made footfall in continental Europe, that wasn't going to end. Sorry, my lights have gone off. I'll be back in a second. I think the point is that throughout the Cold War, with the creation of NATO in 1949, and then the continuation of the American commitment in the decades afterwards, the threat of the Soviet Union, I guess, seemed so ever present that the commitment was almost something that could be taken for granted. I think things got a lot more complicated after 1991 with the end of the Cold War, and there wasn't such an immediately obvious threat. Now, of course, we're in a somewhat different environment again because of the war in Ukraine and the rise of the potential threat from Russia. But there's also an increasing skepticism, both in the United States and also other countries, about whether the commitment ought to be kept up. So it is definitely a moment of sort of. It's hard to tell, isn't it? You know, what will the commitment be like in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now? I think it's very hard to say.
Yeah. Elaine, I know in covering these D-Day remembrances, you have spoken to some of these veterans, and it is actually remarkable because, you know, they were all sort of around 100 years old at this point. But still, remember this day like it was yesterday, can give you such vivid details. We spoke to a veteran earlier this week who was a gunner in a plane, and he said, "I'm so glad we didn't have color TV back then because you cannot see the blood that I saw." It was very moving. I'm wondering, in your conversations with some of these veterans, what kind of stands out to you about how they understood what they were doing, their commitment to the cause, and how they feel about it so many years later?
Many of the young men who came here from the US knew nothing about war. Most of them knew nothing about Europe. For many, their first sight of France or of Europe was the beach down below. And for many, unfortunately, it was also their last. But those who survived and lived to tell the tale talk about how scared they were, how uncertain they were, how they were concerned about hanging on to their buddies who were with them because they felt there's some level of safety in numbers and also some way of kind of feeding off each other on the courage because they were scared. And they said, you know, if I feel I've got someone beside me, then we all have to go together, and we're doing it for us as well. And so many of them never talked about it for years as well. This is why sometimes some of these veterans have only come in the last few years or the last couple of decades because they just didn't want to relive it. They didn't want to talk of it. Many children of veterans will tell you they knew almost nothing until they had children themselves. And it was easier for the men to talk to their grandchildren and say, this is what happened.
Elaine, we're just going to take a moment now to listen into the ceremonies there in Normandy. All right, we're just looking there as dignitaries are starting to get seated. You can see the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin seated there. He will be making remarks a little later on. The schedule here is running a little behind. That's no surprise. It's quite an endeavor, not just to mark this day, but on the 80th anniversary. There have been a number of events taking place and a number of high-level dignitaries, heads of state, present here. Elaine, do you know, I mean, I can't imagine sort of what went into planning the events over the last several days. Do you know if France, if there were any hiccups
Yeah, preparations have been going on for months now. Some of it is already known, and the cemetery is in charge of what happens within the walls here. But there's a huge issue with security. France is on its highest threat alert level because there was an attack, or an attempted attack, a few months ago, which they believe was linked to that bombing in a Russian concert hall. And so the security, which is usually high for these events, was just ramped up and left there because we have the Olympics as well. And that makes life very complicated. If anyone tried to turn up today and they were late, even if they had a ticket, even if they were with a veteran, they would not get in because the police, the gendarme, the military, who are all around, would have to stop them. And also, we're on the coastline of Normandy. The roads are very narrow, very winding. And if you're bringing in guests in big, wide buses, wide coaches, many of them get stuck. We were caught many times on the roads over the last several days where you found one large vehicle going this way, another wide one that way, and nothing would move. So that makes it a logistical nightmare as well. And of course, you mentioned the issue of the Russian invitation and would they, wouldn't they? And Macron had said from the start, we cannot invite President Putin because of what he's doing in Ukraine, but we might invite the delegation, as in from the embassy. In the end, there will not be a Russian delegation here. But then you've also got the little headaches, like part of the reason we're running late is that the first ceremony of the day was on the British beaches with the British veterans, the British military. And so President Macron has to get from there over to here. President Biden came in on Marine One, slightly easier. Macron is going by road.
And you know, one of the veterans that are here, do we have an idea of just how many veterans were able to make the journey? And I imagine that there must be sort of special precautions kind of put in place for them. These are very elderly people. These are national treasures.
There are more than 100 World War II veterans here. We were told there would be a handful or a dozen of D-Day veterans. It's unclear. I already know of two who, in the end, were too ill to make it, one of whom lives in Normandy. So it's a bit of a moving thing, and it's definitely very difficult for them to get around. They all have people in the various organizations who take care of the veterans, who are in charge of making sure that they are comfortable, making sure that they are kept well, that they can be brought here in wheelchairs, that the ceremony isn't too much for them, and even things like how they built the stage up at that main platform that you can see, because it's a sunny day, it has to be so built so that there is enough shade for them, because you don't want them sitting in the heat for any length of time. As you say, they're all around 100 years old, and it's a tough age to be trying to deal with the heat. It's also not an easy age to sit still for that long, to be moved around all the time. But most of them are, you know, they're very game. They're saying, we want to be here. This is an important day. And they're the last living voices. And it's very important that they can be here.
Certainly. Professor Allport, I want to sort of jump on that. This is probably the last significant anniversary of D-Day where we will have veterans of that day present. What will we lose when we lose our last veteran?
That's a great question. Of course, we know something about this experience because it's happened with other great historical events and historical conflicts. So the same problem came up in the 1950s when the final Civil War veterans died in this country. Obviously, it's a transitional moment because, you know, up till this point, so much about the commemorations of D-Day have been about the veterans and about reliving that kind of lived experience of the past, and that won't be with us anymore. But I think we can also see from the experience of the way that the Civil War, for instance, is commemorated, that I'm sure that it will continue. It will just be a different kind of thing. We will have to rely, of course, upon the other kinds of documentary evidence that we have for the past. I mean, at least with the 1940s, unlike the Civil War, you know, we have movie pictures and we have all of these interviews that have been done over the years. It's a good question, though, about whether it will have the same meaning for people who either don't personally have any memory of D-Day or don't have any memory of those who were adults at the time. I mean, from people of my generation, my grandparents grew up in World War II, and so it was very much part of my childhood and early years. And it's going to be a little bit different from this point onwards. But I think that D-Day is has such a kind of resonance in the historical memory that I would be surprised if it didn't simply transition into something else.
I was struck by Elaine talking about how, a lot of the young men who stormed the beach really didn't know what they were getting into. They knew where they had to go, and that was it. And I'm curious about when you reflect on the young men who participated in this, and you consider how young they are. What are some of the things that come to mind? Or, sorry, they were.
Oh, I mean, it's astonishing to think that these boys, really, rather than men in many cases, who were scarcely teenagers. And when you are a teenage private soldier, General Eisenhower isn't going to explain the plan to you. You're simply told what to do, and you go ahead and you do it. And I always wonder about what must have been going through the minds of some of these soldiers, both as they dropped from C-47s as paratroopers, or whether when they landed in the landing craft on that morning. Of course, they had no idea what was going to happen next. They had no idea whether this was going to be a success or a failure, whether they were going to survive the day or not. And also, of course, remember that D-Day is just the start of the campaign.
Yeah.
The campaign in Normandy goes on for another 2 months, and it's extremely brutal campaign.
Professor, I may cut into you because I can see that things are starting to sort of move on the stage in Normandy. We'll wait and see if anything actually gets started. But I do want to talk a little bit more about what you just said, because I think, for many people, D-Day, you hear D-Day was the beginning of the end. But the end took an awful long time. And I was struck by how long it took the troops to liberate the first French town in the region.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, exactly. D-Day is a success, but the troops are barely off the beaches, and the Germans on June 7th, 1944, have by no means decided to quit, and indeed, they will spend the next several days and weeks trying ferociously to push the Allies back off the beaches, and they bring their tanks up, they bring their highly experienced, trained troops up. And it's also worth bearing in mind that most of the Allied troops who landed on D-Day had no previous battle experience. They had not been in combat before. They had been well trained, they were well equipped, but they really were very rookies in comparison with many of the German troops. So this campaign was going to carry on for days, into weeks, eventually into months. Very large numbers of casualties. Normandy, if for those who have been there, particularly in Western Normandy, you have these bocages, these extraordinary hedgerows in the French countryside, which can be. I mean, I'm quite a tall chap, but these things can be up to 15 feet high above you. Perfect positions to defend, and the Allies had to try and bulldoze their way through this, hedgerow by hedgerow, field by field, with the Germans tenaciously holding on to every scrap of ground that they could have. So, yes, D-Day is just the beginning of what's going to be a very, very bitter campaign.
And why do you think, though, it was a pivotal operation, though, a pivotal battle? What was happening with Germany that, while they were able to sort of hold off for a while, this was the turning point?
Well, the Allies had been slowly building up strength for several years. D-Day is a culmination in the sense of it is this extraordinary amount of preparation that had to take place. The Allies by 1944 have an overwhelming preponderance of troops, of aircraft, tanks, of all of the kind of the material requirements of war. Much of this built up in the United States thanks to this extraordinary mobilization of war industry during the war. But the thing is, of course, is that the Germans still have to be beaten, which means that you still have to physically land in continental Europe, and you have to make your way, if necessary, all the way to Berlin, hundreds of miles away. And they are not going to quit. It is quite obvious by 1944 that even though writing might be on the wall for the Third Reich, most of the German troops, most of the German people are not going to surrender until they are literally forced to. So, on the one hand, you can look at the first few months of 1944 and think, well, the Allies have sort of are bound to win in the end. But that victory did still have to be enacted. You still had to land teenagers on the beaches of Normandy, and you had to force your way, again, hundreds of miles through France, through the Low Countries, into Germany itself. Nobody knew how long it was going to take on D-Day. I mean, there were expectations that this might go on for well into 1945, as it did, but perhaps even into 1946 or beyond, because especially in the early weeks of the Normandy campaign, the progress is very, very slow. They're taking hundreds or thousands of yards rather than miles every day. And General Eisenhower at one point becomes sort of in a moment of frustration. He says, if this carries on like this, we'll have to, use 1,000 tons of bombs for every mile to get to Berlin, and we'll still be here when we're into old age. So the Allies do have huge advantages by 1944, which they have been able to build up. But the prospect of actually beating Hitler's Germany remains a very formidable one, and one that it's very unclear how long it's going to take or what the cost will be.
Elaine, I hope that you are seeing what's happening on the stage in Normandy, and hopefully you can sort of talk us through. But it looks like we have some veterans standing now as the ceremony gets underway.
Yes, the ceremony is running late, so they are now showing a video of what was happening at the time. It's a historical look through. The veterans are there waiting for what will be the very first part of the official ceremony, which is a flyover by the American C-130 Hercules planes. And you can see, I think there, that President Macron and his wife Brigitte are already here. They will be welcomed by President Biden, and it's all starting now.
Yeah, I think, there we see President Biden, perfect, and the First Lady as well. So let's dip in.
Distinguished guests, the President of the United States of America and Dr. Biden, accompanied by the President of the French Republic, Mrs. Macron.
Chers invités, le Président des États-Unis d'Amérique et la Dr. Biden, accompagné du président de la République française et de Madame Macron.
Distinguished guests, please remain standing for the national anthem of the French Republic, followed by the national anthem of the United States of America.
Chers invités, veuillez rester debout pour l'hymne national de la République française, suivi de l'hymne national des États-Unis d'Amérique.
Distinguished guests, please remain standing for the invocation delivered by Chaplain Karen Meeker.
Chers invités, veuillez rester debout pour l'invocation prononcée par l'aumônière Karen Meeker.
Let us bow our heads in humble reverence and solemn remembrance. Let us pray. God, when you needed someone to defend freedom, you made a soldier. When you needed someone to fight tyranny, you created a Marine. When you needed someone to protect the skies, you made an airman. When you needed someone to guard the seas, you made the sailor. And to patrol the shores, the Coast Guard. When you needed to send someone brave and true, it has always been and always will be the men and women of the armed forces. When the world needed heroes, you called the greatest generation to courage, and their answer still echoes in the soul of the nation. Shine your eternal light upon those whose gravestones encircle us as silent sentinels, reminding us of the price of liberty. Comfort with your abiding presence those who mourn empty tables and empty chairs, of those who gave their best hopes for our brighter tomorrows. Be our witness, O God, as we stand on this hallowed ground, consecrated in blood, that we will be devoted to the preservation of peace with the same determination as these here who fought fourscore years ago. As storm clouds gather on the horizon once again, rise up, O God, the next greatest generation, to meet every challenge with an unbreakable resolve to do what is right and good in your sight, not counting the cost, but weighing the unfinished work of freedom, a vision where all people can pursue the life to which you have created them. May it be so, I pray, in your holy name. Amen and amen.
Distinguished guests, please take your seats.
Chers invités, veuillez prendre place.
Please welcome the Secretary of the American Battle Monuments Commission, Charles K. DeJew.
Veuillez accueillir le secrétaire de la Commission américaine des monuments de guerre, Charles K. DeJew.
Thank you. President and First Lady Biden, President and Madame Macron, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the American Battle Monuments Commission, Normandy American Cemetery. Bonjour à tous et bienvenue. D-Day is the hinge of history. It is here we reflect the very best of America's values. When America sends its young, its brave, its finest, we do not send them to fight for a king or a crown. We do not fight for a sect or a denomination. We do not fight for a motherland or a fatherland. No, and we never, ever fight for conquest or plunder or enslavement of another people. When America is at its best, America sends its young, its brave, its finest to fight for simple, humble values. The values of freedom, liberty, and democracy. And when the job is done, when the mission is accomplished, when the tyrant is taken down and democracy is stood up, America does something unique in the history of mankind. We go home. All that America asks for in return for the sacrifice of our young, our brave, and our finest are a few small plots of land to bury our dead. All of you are seated here in one of those small plots of land. That is why this date, June 6th, this place, Normandy, and this ceremony here is so important. It is a reminder to all of us of the true cost of war and the real price of freedom. It is a price that we paid on D-Day 80 years ago.
All right, so we're going to pull away from Secretary DeJew, Secretary of the American Battle Monuments Commission. Elaine, the Secretary talked about in his remarks right there, but that all that America asks for is a small plot of land to bury their dead, and that's where you are now. We haven't really talked about the cemetery. It is stunning to look at. Can you sort of give us a little more insight? How many are buried there? and what it's been like there over the past few days.
Anne-Marie, I can tell you exactly how many people are buried here, 9,388. And that is the number of marble headstones here. They're mostly crosses, but there are also plain headstones for the Muslim soldiers who died and some Stars of David for the Jewish soldiers who died. Now, as you can see behind me, it's all in these long lines, in grids, straight lines. Everywhere you look, there is a line of crosses, whether it's a diagonal, whether it's a straight line, whether it's horizontal or vertical. And this is a very carefully designed cemetery. It's a very unique place. They built a reinforced concrete grid underneath it, and the crosses are dropped into that, which not only ensures the design stays perfect, but it means that they don't move. If you've seen old cemeteries, the earth moves, crosses lean over, they topple. And of course here, we're just above the beach. We're on a bluff overlooking Omaha Beach, so this is not the kind of soil that would hold steady. And this way they know it will hold. It also means that when new headstones are added, as happens every now and then, they slot neatly into the grill. Just 2 years ago, a pilot who had been buried in a local cemetery was moved here when his family said, yes, we think we would now like him to be moved to be with his fallen comrades.
That was actually very, very fascinating. I want to go back to the ceremony, though, because President Emmanuel Macron is speaking.
Mesdames et messieurs, ces humbles tombes blanches qui sont juste là, à portée de main derrière vous, sont un des lieux les plus émouvants de France. On y sent vibrer l'histoire, l'héroïsme des morts et celui des vivants. On y lit la grandeur d'un peuple prêt à mourir.
All right, we're going to pull away from President Macron. Apologies for the French speakers. He will, I'm told he should be pivoting to English at some point, and we'll dip back in if he does. He is followed by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who will be speaking, and then, of course, the President of the United States. But, Professor, let me talk to you about the casualties. There were young men who barely made it out of the water or didn't make it out of the water. When the Secretary talks about America, bringing their youngest and their best, there was a lot lost there on the beaches.
Yes, I mean, there are about 10,000 casualties on D-Day, of which about half are killed, something in the region of 4,000 to 5,000 troops, both soldiers, sailors, airmen. The Germans were not going to give up without a fight, and especially in some of the beach areas, the fighting was particularly ferocious. So Omaha Beach, of course, is famously the beach landing in which there was the greatest opposition and which there were the greatest casualties. It probably ought to be said, though, that, and it's a testament to the careful planning that went into D-Day, that the casualty figures were far lower than had been originally expected or feared. So General Eisenhower had been told that something like 2/3 of all of the troops who landed might be killed or wounded by the end of the day, which was a terrible prospect to imagine. There had been huge hospitals which had been set up in southern England to be able to handle the casualties that were expected to come across the channel that day. In the event, there are certainly some very considerable sacrifices that have to be made. Casualty figures are much, much lower than had been feared. And so, again, that's a testament to the incredible amount of, both of courage, but also of very careful preparation and expertise that was used in order to try and make D-Day as much of a success as possible.
I wonder if you can give any insight, I don't know if you can, but into some of the other people who would have been on that beach. I'm thinking about support staff. I'm thinking about medics. I'm thinking about the media, members of the press. A lot of what I've been watching leading up to this, of course, has been sort of old news reports, old film, radio. I'm curious about the impact that the media coverage had on the families at home as they were sort of learning about what their loved ones were enduring.
Yes, D-Day was unusual, I guess, or a new kind of way of making war, in that it was possible to bring moving pictures back directly from the battlefield. Of course, we're not quite in the era of television in 1944, but you do have cine cameras there. There are war cameramen and war journalists who land with the troops. There are the famous photographs of from Omaha Beach of Robert Capa, and footage of the landings was taken back to England as soon as possible, and ultimately back to the United States. And within a few days, it was possible for cinema goers. Of course, this is in 1944. Most people saw moving pictures, again, not through television, but through going to the movies, going to the cinema. People would have been able to watch the newsreel footage there. And it did bring home to people, I think, in a way which had not been possible in previous conflicts, just what a visceral experience it had been to be present. The Allies knew that it was going to be, public opinion and morale on the home front was very important. It was necessary to create that kind of information back to people whose loved ones might be serving in Normandy. They wanted to be able to see as much as possible of what was going on. And so even on the day, carrier pigeons were taken by some of the journalists so that they could fly messages back to England to let the early newspapers know, some of the information about the progress of the invasion.
Fascinating. Why do we call this the greatest generation?
Well, that's a term that was coined in the 1990s, wasn't it? As I think the generation of people who had served, who had been either been adults in the war, who had actually served in the war. My grandparents' generation, who were all born, around about 1920 or so, had served. I mean, there's a lot of debate. I mean, there's no question that that generation made some extraordinary sacrifices, and their achievements were.
Professor, I'm just going to cut into you a little bit. I believe President Macron is now speaking in English.
Telle fut l'exclamation de Norman Cotta, sous le feu de la mitraille, à ces hommes, sous la pluie d'obus. Vous êtes venus ici, alors vous voilà à jamais chez vous, sur le sol de France, et nous n'oublions pas. À vous.
All right, so he was, for a moment, I think we may have missed it a little, but should he start to speak English again, we'll try to catch it this time. Professor, just to sort of revisit the concept of the greatest generation, because I know the phrase, as you point out, was coined in the 90s, but it comes, I think, as I understood it, from the heroic efforts that were made during World War II and the sacrifices that were made. And even though it seems like, many of these men were quite young and really didn't have a full concept, for some of them, of what they were getting themselves into, you don't pull off an operation like D-Day by revealing too much. It was top secret. The more people to be aware of it, the more likelihood that a dangerous leak could happen. And so they were sort of throwing themselves into the belief that this was for the greater good.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Again, private soldiers don't get to, hear top secret plans. The need to keep information about the D-Day plan as secret as possible had been understood for a long time, and there were extraordinary lengths taken in order to try and both conceal information about the invasion and also to confuse the Germans about where the attack would actually come. Much of what happened that day was this enormous kind of decoy operation that took place further to the north and east on the French coast in order to try and persuade the Germans what was going on in Normandy was actually just a kind of feint, and the real invasion was actually going to take place around the Pas de Calais. So they had a whole fake invasion fleet up in the north. There was a huge dummy army that was supposed to be based in southeast England, made up of inflatable tanks and wooden tanks.
Wow.
So, secrecy and the need to keep as many people as possible in the dark, including, of course, most Allied soldiers, was at a priority.
I just want to point out what's happening here. We're watching the Legion of Honor, and perhaps a little bit earlier in our coverage, you may have seen director Steven Spielberg and actor Tom Hanks. As you know, Steven Spielberg directed two incredibly powerful award-winning movies about World War II, Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan. Tom Hanks starred in Saving Private Ryan, perhaps part of the reason that they are there today. Those two movies had an incredible impact on a lot of people who were, at least in time, distant from those moments. Let's just dip in a little bit to this coverage.
Monsieur John Wardle, au nom de la République française, nous vous faisons chevalier de la Légion d'honneur.
Thank you very much.
No, he wants to stay. He wants to stand. Monsieur Robert Pelligot, au nom de la République française, nous vous faisons chevalier de la Légion d'honneur.
Elaine, I want to bring you in right now because you had mentioned this award that several American veterans, were going to be receiving from Emmanuel Macron. Can you give us a little more insight?
This is the highest honor that France can pay to anybody, whether they're French or foreign. These men are being made Knights of the Legion of Honor, and they're getting that for eminent merit in the service of France. Now, this is given only to a handful of foreigners, and other veterans have received this on other years. It is very much a thank you from the heart, from France to these men. And you can see how it's very important to them too. They're many of them in wheelchairs, and they're doing their absolute best to stand up to receive it. Some saluting. It's a lot of dignity here, a lot of pride, and clearly a lot of respect from France, as well as the gratitude and the love that they have been showered on from France, because these were the men who 80 years ago helped to free this land.
And I don't know, do you know anything more about any of the men that are receiving this honor, what they're being recognized for doing?
We don't have details on who they are. This is partly because the numbers of veterans is quite small, and they didn't want to commit to whether or not they would be here. I was due to go to a ceremony 2 days ago where a veteran we've interviewed before was to be honored, and in the end he wasn't well enough to go. We do know that of the dozen or so here, that they're not all D-Day veterans, they're mostly World War II veterans. Now there are, as I said, some 1 to 200 World War II veterans at the ceremonies around Normandy today, and this is the largest number of veterans from the US that have been to these ceremonies in any year. And I think that's also partly in recognition that this could be the last time any of them can make the trip. Already, this has been a huge trip for most of them, crossing the Atlantic in order to come here. And you see again, standing, because they want to do that, and they want to accept it with the kind of dignity that they feel they still have. And of course they do. And the President Macron, honouring each of them individually, President Biden saying a few words too. It's very much a personal moment for these men, as well as a personal moment for the two presidents to be able to say, man to man, you are here, you helped save us, thank you. And in honour of that, you are now a knight of France's Legion of Honour.
Yeah, it is incredibly moving to watch these men stand to meet these two world leaders. And, you know, if there's one thing that President Biden, I think he's actually particularly good at, is these sort of interactions, saying thank you, recognizing the weight of the sacrifice that these men have made, the weight that they have carried over the last several decades because of the things that they have seen. The president often takes time out to show this sort of appreciation, and there's President Macron continuing to pin the honor on the lapels of these gentlemen. Professor, as you watch this unfold, and you think about the ways in which we have marked this day and marked this war, do you think that, you know, I wonder sometimes if the memory is fading of the significance of this moment. It's now 80 years since the beginning of the end of World War II. I have a 13-year-old daughter at home, and you know, this is something that at some point she'll probably learn it in school, but she hasn't yet. And I wonder how much is being lost.
Well, I think every generation will remember and experience this in a slightly different way. You know, this has been ever since World War II itself. We've gone through the generation that were present and remembered it at first hand. Then those of their parents and then their grandparents. We are getting further and further away, obviously, from the lived experience. And this is probably what makes today so remarkable, is that this will be the last, probably not the last occasion in which there is a veteran, but certainly the last occasion in which there are any significant number of veterans who can be present. You know, I think, though, I am always fairly optimistic about this kind of thing. I think that there are reasons why Americans will continue to return to the memory of World War II. I think it is an extraordinary moment in the country's history. And just as there have been, you know, other events in American history which have faded from personal memory, it doesn't mean to say that they don't still reverberate very strongly. So I am, you know, I am confident that even though younger people who don't have any personal memory of this, or even really of people who were involved, I still think that they will be able to draw a great deal from this.
Have you been to the region, Normandy?
I have, yes. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago. I've been to the American Cemetery where the ceremony is taking place today. I was listening to your commentators at the site, and I agree, it's an extraordinary place. The day I was there, obviously, was much quieter, and it overlooks Omaha Beach. It's a very, very moving place with this extraordinary arrangement of the gravestones there in the symmetrical patterns, and it's very quiet. Often, as I say, on a day like I visited most days where there aren't many visitors, it's very contemplative. And then to actually go to the beaches themselves, I've been to Omaha Beach, which again on the day that I was there was almost empty, just a few local kids playing and things like that. And it is extraordinary to try and recreate in your mind. You see this place which seems so placid, seems so calm now, and to imagine what it must have been like 80 years ago, when it was literally the worst place on earth to be standing, is quite something.
Yeah, I wondered about that because people describe it as beautiful and serene, and I wonder with somebody like you with such knowledge of the details of that day, whether or not you could see it when you looked at the beaches now.
Well, one of the things that if you have the opportunity to go to Omaha Beach, one of the things that you see there is that you see these bluffs, these high cliffs, which are just beyond the beach. And they are pretty much the same as they would have been in 1944. One of the things about the area is that it's quite undeveloped. I mean, it's still to a very surprising degree, the same as it would have been on D-Day. And you look at this and you think, oh my goodness, because as you walk up the beach and you look at these bluffs, all of these bluffs would have been held by German troops who had machine guns and mortars and cannons. And they would have been, ever since the first moment when the troops had landed, they were raining shells down on the beach. And there's no cover. There's no place to take cover. It must have been a terrifying experience. You wonder how anybody managed to get off there alive.
Yeah. Elaine, I'm going to ask you sort of the same question because I know you've been there as well. When you look at the beaches and try to sort of recall what we know about that day, what is it like?
It is so strange, Anne-Marie, because the beaches are so long and there's usually at low tide there is a lot of sand before the sea. And some days in summer, there are just tourists there are children playing on the beach, and you have to remind yourself of what it was like. And earlier, we were doing traveling through the areas around Omaha Beach, looking at the photos from then and taking pictures today and seeing the difference. So when you think about what happened and you look at how much beach there was for them to cross, because they couldn't come at high tide, they needed low tide, but it meant they were open for a long time. You look up at the bluff and there's so much open space for the Germans to look out and say, okay, let us kill them. And that's what they did. They just opened fire. And these young men had to just keep going through a hail of German bullets. And so many of them were just slaughtered there on the beach, cut down before they ever got anywhere.
It is. I thank both of you for sort of painting such a great picture for us. I think that you cannot stop reminding us of how difficult this was, how challenging those first few moments were, how many young men were not able to make it off that beach, and how many young men saw their brothers fall and continue with the mission. I want to dip back into the ceremony. Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, is speaking.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and above all, the veterans of World War II. I am honored to stand again at this hallowed place. We bow our heads to remember the more than 9,000 U.S. and Allied soldiers killed or wounded on D-Day by Hitler's forces. On behalf of the United States Department of Defense, I am here to give thanks, inadequate as that word may be. 80 years later, we thank the young Americans who took the beaches, who helped liberate France, and who helped free this continent from Nazi tyranny. We thank every Allied warrior who fought for freedom on June 6, 1944. And we thank the American and Allied veterans who have rallied once more on the shores of Normandy. Victors of D-Day, we are humbled by your presence. The young Americans who fought through the clamor and the chaos on D-Day have grown old or left us. And whenever a veteran of D-Day is gathered to his maker, In the fullness of time, after a long life lived in freedom, he wins a final victory over Hitler. You helped defeat what Churchill called a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalog of human crime. And you laid the foundation for a more just, free, and decent world. Together with our allies, we built peace out of war, a hard-headed peace, a peace renewed by constant commitment, a peace forged by the generation that won the bloodiest war in human history. And so our gratitude must never fade. Our memories must never dim, and our resolve must never fail. We still seek a world where aggression is a sin, and where human rights are sacred, and where all people can live in freedom. And so we must rally again to defend the open, post-war world of rules, rights, and responsibilities. Those rules protect us. Those rights define us. And those responsibilities summon us once more. At this hinge in history, we must again stand firm against aggression and tyranny. And as I said here last year, if the troops of the world's democracies could risk their lives for freedom then, surely the citizens of the world's democracy can risk our comfort for freedom now. So let us again uphold the spirit of D-Day. Let us again defend the principles that the Allied armies carried. And let us again thank the heroes of D-Day who kept freedom alive for us all. You saved the world. You saved the world, and we must only defend it. Gentlemen, we salute you. May God bless the American and Allied troops who fought here. May God bless the United States of America, and may God bless all who cherish human freedom. Thank you.
We will be hearing from the President of the United States, President Biden, shortly. In the meantime, as we wait for him to rise, Professor Allport, I want to ask you about something else. We've just been listening to the Secretary of Defense. Operation Overlord and D-Day had never been done before, nothing like this. It took incredible coordination. It also took innovation. I mean, they literally had to create things that didn't exist before. Can we talk about that?
Sure. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that the planners knew is that they were going to have to attempt something that had never been attempted on that scale before. And there were all kinds of practical problems that were going to have to be addressed in terms of landing on the beach, getting off the beaches, being able to supply and support the troops once they had gotten off the beaches. So the British developed a whole armored division called the 79th Division, which was called the Funnies, which had all of these remarkable specialized tanks that were designed in order to try and clear mines off the beaches. They would have flails which would blow up mines so that they could advance off the beach, and that some of these tanks could lay carpets to allow vehicles like trucks to be able to drive off the soft beaches. So it's partly about clearing mines, creating pathways. They wanted to be able to climb, of course, the bluffs or the hills that might have surrounded the beaches. They had to develop a lot of special weapons in order to be able to blow through concrete emplacements and pillboxes and things like that. I mean, the level of ingenuity that was involved was extraordinary. One of the things that they did, I see pictures of the paratroopers there, is that they dropped dummy paratroopers all over Europe, all over Normandy on the night of June 5th, 6th. So these were deliberately intended to confuse the Germans. They would have these straw dummies packed with fireworks and things like that. So when they landed, they would kind of blow up and it would sound like gunfire. The idea was to try and throw off all of the German defenders as to where exactly the Allies were landing. And again, some of this stuff was stuff of sort of science fiction, and yet it worked. They brought an enormous pipeline, which was laid under the water called Pluto, in order to try and bring oil up to fuel the tanks and the vehicles. They created 2 artificial harbours called the Mulberry Harbours, which were built in England and then towed across the English Channel, because it was going to take a while for it to create a port. So yes, that you can understand when you get into the details about why it took 2 or more years to plan this, and even on the day, despite all of this meticulous preparation, I mean, lots of things go wrong. The paratroopers end up, in many cases, landing in the wrong places. The weather is unexpectedly bad. Some of the troops land on the wrong beaches because there's no GPS in 1944, and to some extent, you have to rely upon maps and tidal patterns and things which are very unpredictable. So the wonder of it all is to somebody reading about this is how much went right, actually, rather than how much went wrong.
Yeah, and we sort of showed the map of the shoreline and how it had been divided into 5 different beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, with the Americans taking the first 2, Utah and Omaha. But you talk about some of the troops not landing on the right beach. Initially, troops did not. Were there some troops that did not actually land on Omaha, but it turned out to be a better spot to land?
Well, what happened at Omaha was that at all of the beaches, there had been a lot of attempts to try and suppress the German opponents, the opposition. So they would send in naval warships to try and bombard the coast. They would send aircraft in to attack them, and in many cases, they were also bringing in amphibious tanks that were that could ride across the water and before they landed on the beach. And for a variety of reasons, at Omaha, a lot of these things didn't work out as planned. That's the famous line is that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Well, that was especially true at Omaha. So there were moments when things were going especially badly at Omaha in the opening hours.
I'm going to jump in on you now because President Biden has taken to the podium.
The hour had nearly come. Monday, June 5th, 1944. The evil, Hitler's Third Reich was devastating the world. Nazi Germany had subjugated the once free nations of Europe through brute force, lies, and twisted ideology of racial superiority. Millions of Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Millions of others killed by bombs, bullets, bloody warfare. Hitler and those with him thought democracies were weak, that the future belonged to dictators. Here, the coast of Normandy, the battle between freedom and tyranny would be joined. Here, on that June morning, the testing was at hand. President Macron, Mrs. Macron, Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, distinguished guests, most of all, our honored veterans who met that test at the ages, a test of ages to that moment, 80 years ago. 80 years ago today. On behalf of the American people and as Commander-in-Chief, it's the highest honor to be able to salute you here in Normandy once more. All of you, God love you. Winston Churchill called what happened here, quote, the greatest, most complicated operation ever, end of quote. After years of planning, Operation Overlord was ready to launch just as soon as the weather turned. Across the choppy English Channel, the Supreme Commander of the Allies, Dwight D. Eisenhower, waited. The largest force ever of its kind, built by 12 nations. Men, guns, planes, naval craft of every description waited. The world, captive and free, waited. Finally, Eisenhower's forecasters said there was a window in the weather. It would open briefly on Tuesday, the 6th of June. The general weighed the options and gave the order. At dawn, the Allies would strike. The great crusade to free Europe from tyranny would begin. That night, General Eisenhower drove to the English town of Newbury to visit paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. There were men from all over America. It was estimated that 80% of them would be killed within hours. That was the estimate. But they were brave, they were resolute, and they were ready. One soldier told General Eisenhower, quote, don't worry, sir. The 101st is on the job. Everything will be taken care of. That's what he said. And because of their courage and their resolve, because the courage and resolve of their allies, it was taken care of. From the sea and sky, nearly 160,000 Allied troops descended on Normandy. Many, to state the obvious, never came home. Many survived that longest day, kept on fighting for months until victory was finally won. And a few, a notable band of brothers, are here with us today. Kenneth Blaine Smith is here. On that day, under heavy artillery fire, he operated a rangefinder and radar on the first American ship to arrive at Normandy's coast, providing direct gunfire support for the Rangers scaling the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc on their daring mission to take out the German batteries. Bob Gibson is here. He landed on Utah Beach about 10 hours after the invasion began. Bullets flying everywhere, tracers lighting up the sky. Bob drove an M4 tractor with anti-aircraft gun mounted on top, providing critical protection for the infantry against the German Air Force. On that day, and for many days after, he continued. Ben Miller is here, a medic with the 82nd Airborne. At 3 a.m. on June 6th, he and 13 other medics flew over the channel in a rickety glider. Its wings were ripped off by giant poles that the Germans buried halfway in the ground to stop them from landing. They crashed, but they survived. And they did their duty, dragging injured soldiers to safety, treating wounds, saving lives while the battle raged. Every soldier who stormed the beach, who dropped by parachute or landed by glider, every sailor who manned the thousands of ships and landing craft, every aviator who destroyed German-controlled airfields, bridges, and railroads, all were backed by other brave Americans, including hundreds of thousands of people of color and women who courageously served despite unjust limitations on what they could do for their nation. Lewis Brown is here, part of the Red Ball Express, a truck convoy made up of mostly African-American drivers. They landed in Normandy in the wake of D-Day. They rushed supplies to the rapidly advancing front lines. Woody Woodhouse is here, members of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen, who flew over 15,000 sorties during the war. Marjorie Stone is here. She enlisted in the women's branch of the Naval Reserve, became an aircraft mechanic, spent the war keeping American planes and pilots in the air. Theirs has always been the story of America. Just walk the rows of this cemetery as I have. Nearly 10,000 heroes buried side by side, officers and enlisted, immigrants and native-born, different races, different faiths, but all Americans. All served with honor when America and the world needed them most. Millions back home did their part as well. From coast to coast, Americans found countless ways to pitch in. They understood our democracy is only as strong as all of us make it together. The men who fought here became heroes, not because they were the strongest or toughest or most fiercest, although they were, but because they were given an audacious mission, knowing, every one of them knew, the probability of dying was real. But they did it anyway. They knew, beyond any doubt, there are things that are worth fighting and dying for. Freedom is worth it. Democracy is worth it. America is worth it. The world is worth it. Then, now, and always. The war in Europe didn't end for another 11 months. But here, the tide turned in our favor. Here, we proved the forces of liberty are stronger than the forces of conquest. Here, we proved that the ideals of our democracy are stronger than any army or combination of armies in the entire world. We proved something else here as well, the unbreakable unity of the Allies. Here with us are men who served alongside the Americans that day, wearing different flags on their arms, but fighting with the same courage for the same purpose. What the Allies did together 80 years ago far surpassed anything we could have done on our own. It was a powerful illustration of how alliances, real alliances, make us stronger. A lesson that I pray we Americans never forget. Together we won the war. We rebuilt Europe, including our former enemies. It was an investment in what became shared and a prosperous future. We established NATO, the greatest military alliance in the history of the world. And over time, you got it, it is. And over time, we brought more nations into NATO, the NATO alliance, including the newest members, Finland and Sweden. Today, NATO stands at 32 countries strong, and NATO is more united than ever, and even more prepared to keep the peace, deter aggression, defend freedom all around the world. America has invested in our alliances and forged new ones, not simply out of altruism, but out of our own self-interest as well. America's unique ability to bring countries together is an undeniable source of our strength and our power. Isolationism was not the answer 80 years ago and is not the answer today. We know the dark forces that these heroes fought against 80 years ago. They never fade. Aggression and greed, the desire to dominate and control, to change borders by force, these are perennial. The struggle between a dictatorship and freedom is unending. Here in Europe, we see one stark example. Ukraine has been invaded by a tyrant bent on domination. Ukrainians are fighting with extraordinary courage, suffering great losses, but never backing down. They've been inflicted on the Russian aggressors. They've suffered tremendous losses, Russia. The numbers are staggering. 350,000 Russian troops dead or wounded. Nearly 1 million people have left Russia because they can no longer see a future in Russia. The United States and NATO and a coalition of more than 50 countries standing strong with Ukraine. We will not walk away. Because if we do, Ukraine will be subjugated, and it will not end there. Ukraine's neighbors will be threatened. All of Europe will be threatened. And make no mistake, the autocrats of the world are watching closely to see what happens in Ukraine, to see if we let this illegal aggression go unchecked. We cannot let that happen. To surrender to bullies, to bow down to dictators is simply unthinkable. Were we to do that, it means we'd be forgetting what happened here in these hallowed beaches. Make no mistake, we will not bow down. We will not forget. Let me end with this. History tells us freedom is not free. If you want to know the price of freedom, come here to Normandy. Come to Normandy and look. Go to the other cemeteries in Europe where our fallen heroes rest. Go back home to Arlington Cemetery. Tomorrow, I will pay respects at Pointe du Hoc. Go there as well and remember, the price of unchecked tyranny is the blood of the young and the brave. In their generation, in their hour of trial, the Allied forces of D-Day did their duty. Now the question for us is, in our hour of trial, will we do ours? We're living in a time when democracy is more at risk across the world than any point since the end of World War II, since these beaches were stormed in 1944. Now we have to ask ourselves, will we stand against tyranny, against evil, against crushing brutality of the iron fist? Will we stand for freedom? Will we defend democracy? Will we stand together? My answer is yes, and only can be yes. We're not far off from the time when the last living voices of those who fought and bled on D-Day will no longer be with us. So we have a special obligation. We cannot let what happened here be lost in the silence of the years to come. We must remember it, must honor it, and live it. And we must remember the fact that they were heroes here that day does not absolve us from what we have to do today. Democracy is never guaranteed. Every generation must preserve it, defend it, and fight for it. That's the test of the ages. In memory of those who fought here, died here, literally saved the world here. Let us be worthy of their sacrifice. Let us be the generation that when history is written about our time, in 10, 20, 30, 50, 80 years from now, it'll be said, when the moment came, we met the moment. We stood strong. Our alliances were made stronger. We saved democracy in our time as well. Thank you very much, and may God bless you all. May God protect our troops. Thank you.
We've just been listening to President Biden, and our CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe has also been listening to the president. Ed, you are in Paris, not in Normandy, but, we knew that he was going to talk about the need or reflect upon the connective tissue, if you will, between D-Day and the end of World War II and what we are seeing happening in Europe now. He talked about the war in Ukraine, and he alluded to Russia.
He did, Anne-Marie, and I'm sensitive to what else is going on here, so if we need to cut me off, please do. But this was a pretty aggressive speech that arguably had three audiences. One, Europe and the rest of the world, reinforcing the president's concerns about the struggle between democracy and autocracy. The American public, of course, as the American president, making sure they see him here, honoring those that served. But I'd argue there was a third audience, and it was pretty specific, and right there in front of him, dozens of lawmakers of both parties who came to Normandy today, many of whom were responsible for holding up funding to Ukraine over several months that U.S. military, Ukrainian military say held up and caused grave damage to Ukraine and its ability to fight Russia. So notable that he was so aggressive in those remarks, also because Russian officials in the past had attended these commemorations, and they were not invited by the French government to be here this year.
Indeed, Ed. We're going to dip back into the ceremony right now. I believe this is the reading of the watch.
Yes. Even before some of us were born into this world, the men behind me and their brothers and sisters who lay before me stood the watch. In those years, when the storm clouds of war were seen brewing on the horizon of history, they stood the watch. Many times, they would cast an eye ashore and see family standing there, needing guidance and help, needing that hand to hold in those hard times. But still, they stood the watch. They stood the watch 80 years ago. They stood the watch so that we, our families, and our fellow countrymen and women can sleep soundly in safety each and every night, knowing that these veterans stood the watch. Today, we are here to say, World War II veterans, the watch stands relieved. Relieved by those you have trained, guided, and led. American World War II veterans, you stand relieved. We have the watch.
Present all.
Distinguished guests, please rise if you are able, as we salute those memorialized here at Normandy American Cemetery, and remain standing for the playing of La Sonnerie au Mort and taps, and the departure of the official party.
Chers invités, veuillez vous lever si vous le pouvez pour saluer ceux qui sont commémorés ici au cimetière américain de Normandie et rester debout pour l'interprétation de la sonnerie aux morts et de taps et pour le départ de la délégation officielle.
So we are nearing the conclusion of today's events. We heard a reading of the poem "The Watch," which is often read at retirement services for Marines. The Bugle, a song "La Sonnière aux Morts," which is the French Armed Forces bugle call, often at funerals or to commemorate battles or wars, and then of course taps, and then the flyover that you saw right there. I want to just pivot back over to Ed O'Keefe. Ed, you mentioned the multiple audiences that the president was speaking to with his remarks. And he also sort of dropped a line about isolationism, and that it does not have a place today here. And I thought about America First, which has been used over and over again for many, many different things. But during World War II, it was a slogan that was used to argue against America's involvement in the Second World War. And it's a slogan that we have now seen again in recent years.
Yeah, but I think more broadly, it was his message to the world again that while aggression and greed and the desire to dominate and control are commonplace, it has to be eradicated, and by specifically targeting what Russia is doing, saying that Ukraine is dealing with a power that's bent on domination and facing grave losses but never backing down. Giving Volodymyr Zelensky and his country that kind of public support at such a solemn event was a notable use of this moment to commemorate the sacrifice of those who died on D-Day, but to remind the world of the struggle that continues, especially right now in Europe. Saying that illegal aggression by Russia cannot go unchecked. We cannot let that happen. To surrender to bullies, to bog down to bullies is simply unthinkable. And again, to do that at events that used to include representation from Russia will be seen around the world as a notable repudiation of what Russia is up to in Ukraine. Anne-Marie.
Ed, absolutely great point. Thank you so much, Ed O'Keefe, Elaine Cobb, Professor Alan Allport. Thank you so much for being with me during the last hour or so. Your insight has been invaluable. And you have been watching special coverage of D-Day, the 80th anniversary ceremony in Normandy, France.